A warning to our viewers. What you're about to watch is a true crime story. This story contains details that may be disturbing to some audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everyone. I'm Brittany Bailey. It is one of the most shocking and horrifying murder cases to ever happen in East Tennessee, one that took 2 young lives full of promise and put their families through 8 criminal trials. The tragic murders shocked the community and the families of these 2 young victims. We do have a warning. The details of this case may not be suitable for some of you. According to the investigation, Chris Newsom was an hour or 2 before his death. In his final moments, he was marched barefoot to a nearby railroad track. He was shot 3 times in the neck, back, and head. The killers had stuffed a sock in his mouth, tied his wrists and ankles, and covered his head with a sweatshirt tied around his neck with shoestrings.
January 2007. Knoxville, Tennessee awakens to discover that monsters walk among us. A railroad worker making his rounds discovers a body burned, bound, and abandoned on the tracks. Within hours, investigators would uncover evidence of crimes so brutal that seasoned detectives would struggle to maintain their composure in court. But this wasn't the work of a single killer. This was orchestrated by 5 individuals who had turned a rental house into a chamber of horrors. What happened over those 48 hours in January would become one of the most shocking murder cases in American history. 2 young people with bright futures ahead of them became victims of unthinkable cruelty. Their names were Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Christopher Newsom embodied everything good about small-town American values. Born and raised in Knoxville, Chris was the kind of young man parents hoped their daughters would bring home. At Halls High School, he excelled on the baseball diamond not because he was the most naturally gifted athlete, but because he had something coaches couldn't teach: heart. Teammates remember a player who lifted others up, who played every game with integrity, who understood that character mattered more than statistics. After graduation, while many of his peers left for distant colleges, Chris chose to stay home. He enrolled at Pellissippi State Community College and learned the carpentry trade. By 23, he had built a reputation as a craftsman whose work you could count on. Drive through Knox County today, and you'll still find examples of Chris Newsom's handiwork crown molding and custom cabinetry that bear witness to a young man who took pride in creating things built to last. Chris was reliable in every aspect of his life. Friends knew that when he said he'd be somewhere, he'd be there. When he made plans, he kept them. When he sent a text, he replied to yours. This reliability would become crucial to the investigation because when Chris Newsom went silent, everyone who knew him understood immediately that something was terribly wrong. Channon Christian was born in Texas, but found her home in Tennessee when her family relocated to Knoxville when she was 12. From the moment she walked into Farragut High School, it was clear she was someone special. Teachers remember Channon as more than just an excellent student. She was the kind of person who could brighten a room simply by walking into it. She possessed that rare combination of intelligence, ambition, and genuine warmth that drew people to her like a magnet. But Channon's beauty and charisma weren't her most defining characteristics. She had a plan. By January 2007, she was in her final semester at the University of Tennessee, studying sociology not because it was an easy path, but because she wanted to make a meaningful difference in the world. She had dreams of working with underserved communities, of being an advocate for those who needed someone in their corner. Her parents, Gary and Dina Christian, watched their daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. Here was a young woman who could have chosen any path in life, who could have focused solely on her own success, but instead chose to dedicate herself to helping others. On the 6th of January 2007, Channon's future stretched out before her like an open highway. She was weeks away from graduation, months away from beginning the career she dreamed of, and deeply in love with a young man who shared her values and supported her dreams. None of them, not Channon, not Chris, not their families, could have imagined that this ordinary Saturday would be their last day together. Saturday, the 6th of January, 2007, began like countless other weekends for young couples across America. Channon and Chris had simple plans, dinner, maybe a movie, then a party with friends. The kind of evening that creates memories you carry for a lifetime. Channon spent the afternoon at her friend's apartment on Washington Pike in North Knoxville, getting ready with the care and excitement that comes with being young and in love. Friends would later remember her being in particularly good spirits that day, looking forward to the evening ahead. Around 8 p.m., Chris arrived to pick her up, driving his reliable pickup truck. Security cameras captured what should have been just another ordinary moment. A young woman walking across a parking lot to meet her boyfriend. A brief embrace, a few minutes of conversation as they decided which vehicle to take. They chose Channon's Toyota 4Runner. It was a decision that would cost them their lives. Somewhere in the shadows of that parking lot, 5 predators had been watching, waiting, calculating. They had spent the evening driving through Knoxville neighborhoods, searching for victims, people they could rob, terrorize, and worse. At approximately 9 p.m., Channon Christian's vehicle was carjacked. Within moments, 2 young people planning an ordinary Saturday night became prisoners of 5 individuals who saw them not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. To understand the horror that followed, you need to know about the 5 people who would turn a Knoxville rental house into a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares. 25-year-old Lamarcus Davidson was a career criminal who had recently been released from prison after serving time for carjacking and aggravated robbery. The house at 2316 Chipman Street was his rental and had become a hub for drug dealing and criminal planning. Davidson wasn't just a criminal, he was a predator with a history of violence who had learned nothing from his time behind bars. Within months of his release, he was back to organizing violent crimes, this time with a group of accomplices who shared his complete lack of regard for human life. 24-year-old Latalvis Cobbins was Davidson's half-brother, another career criminal with a history of robbery convictions. The brothers seemed to feed off each other's capacity for violence, each one pushing the other toward greater acts of depravity. Known on the streets as Detroit, George Thomas brought his own history of multiple felony convictions to the group. At 24, he had already established a reputation for brutality that made even hardened criminals wary of crossing him. At 34, Eric Boyd was the oldest member of the group. His criminal record stretched back years and included multiple violent offenses. Boyd would later play a crucial role in both the murders and the attempted cover-up that followed. Perhaps the most disturbing member of the group was 8-year-old Vanessa Coleman, Cobbins' girlfriend. To outside observers, she might have appeared to be just another teenager who had fallen in with the wrong crowd. The evidence would tell a very different story. Together, these 5 individuals represented a perfect storm of criminal intent. On the evening of the 6th of January, 2007, they made a collective decision that would result in some of the most heinous crimes in Tennessee history. The carjacking occurred on the evening of the 6th of January, 2007, when Christian's vehicle was targeted. Security footage from the Washington Pike apartment complex would later show the final moments of Channon and Chris's freedom. The couple had just finished deciding to take Channon's 4Runner to their next destination when they found themselves staring down the barrels of loaded firearms. In a matter of seconds, their ordinary Saturday night had become a waking nightmare. Both victims were forced into Channon's own vehicle at gunpoint. Their hands were bound behind their backs with shoelaces, a detail that speaks to the premeditated nature of what would follow. This wasn't a crime of opportunity that spiraled out of control. This was the calculated work of predators who had come prepared to torture and kill. The drive from the apartment complex to 2316 Chipman Street was only about 3 miles, but for Channon and Chris, it must have felt like an eternity. They had no way of knowing where they were being taken, no way of knowing what these strangers intended to do with them, no way of knowing that they would never see their families again. At approximately 9 p.m., the 4Runner pulled into the driveway of Davidson's rental house. What happened over the next 48 hours would shock even experienced law enforcement officers and prosecutors. The house at 2316 Chipman Street became the scene of crimes so brutal that court proceedings would later require multiple breaks as prosecutors and even court personnel struggled to maintain their composure while presenting evidence. The defendants kidnapped, robbed, raped, and killed both victims. The forensic evidence would later reveal the systematic torture that both Channon and Chris endured. Christopher Newsom was the first to die, He had been bound and shot 3 times and set on fire. The medical examiner would testify that Chris had been sexually assaulted before being marched to nearby railroad tracks, where he was executed and his body was burned in an attempt to destroy evidence. Channon Christian's suffering lasted much longer. She was held captive in the house for days, subjected to repeated assaults and torture. The evidence would show that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted by multiple attackers, and ultimately murdered in a way that demonstrated the calculated cruelty of her killers. The physical evidence recovered from the scene painted a picture of crimes that went far beyond murder. These were acts of torture, designed to inflict maximum suffering on 2 innocent people, whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sunday morning, the 7th of January, 2007, a railroad worker, making his morning rounds, discovered what appeared to be a burned body wrapped in bedding on the tracks behind Chipman Street. The body was burned so severely that identification would require dental records. This was Christopher Newsom, but investigators didn't know that yet. What they did know was that they were dealing with a homicide of exceptional brutality. Meanwhile, across town, 2 families were experiencing every parent's worst nightmare. The Christians and the Newsoms were frantically trying to reach their children, who had failed to return home or make contact as promised. When the families contacted police to report their children missing, the initial response was frustrating. Officers suggested that maybe the young couple had simply decided to spend the weekend together, that maybe they were just being irresponsible. The families were told to wait 24 hours before filing missing person reports. But the families knew better. This wasn't like their children. Channon always kept her promises, always called when she said she would. Chris never left people wondering where he was or if he was okay. Taking matters into their own hands, family members and friends organized search parties. They created flyers, contacted cell phone companies, and began systematically searching areas where the couple was last known to have been. The breakthrough came when they discovered Channon's Toyota 4Runner abandoned at the intersection of Chipman Street and Cedar Avenue, less than 2 blocks from Davidson's house. The vehicle immediately told a story of violence. The seats had been repositioned, personal items were missing, and there were cigarettes in the car that belonged to neither Channon nor Chris. Police examined her car and found an envelope. It was dusted for prints and yielded a hit. The fingerprint belonged to Lamarcus Davidson, a known felon with an address at 2316 Chipman Street. On the 9th of January, 2007, police obtained a search warrant for Davidson's house. What they found there would haunt investigators for the rest of their careers. In the kitchen, officers discovered Channon Christian's body. She had been stuffed into a residential garbage can, wrapped in multiple trash bags. The scene was a forensic investigator's nightmare and a family's worst horror realized. The house yielded overwhelming evidence linking all 5 suspects to the crimes. DNA evidence, fingerprints, personal belongings of both victims, and physical evidence that told the story of what had happened during those 48 hours of terror. But Davidson and his accomplices were gone. They had fled the scene, believing they had committed the perfect crime and destroyed all evidence of their involvement. A massive manhunt began. Police issued bulletins for all 5 suspects. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation joined the search. The FBI offered assistance. The net was closing, but the killers had a head start. The break in the case came when investigators traced phone calls between Davidson and Eric Boyd. Under pressure, Boyd agreed to cooperate with police and led them to Davidson's hiding place, a vacant house on Reynolds Street. When police surrounded the location, they found Davidson in possession of crucial evidence: Christopher Newsom's Nike shoes and a .22 caliber revolver that ballistics would later confirm as the murder weapon. Over the next several days, the remaining suspects were arrested one by one. Each arrest brought new evidence, new confessions, and new details about the crimes that had shocked the Knoxville community. The first wave of trials began in 2008. For the Christian and Newsom families, this meant reliving their worst nightmare in excruciating detail as prosecutors methodically presented evidence against each defendant. Eric Boyd was the first to face trial, but only in federal court for being an accessory after the fact. He was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. But the families knew this wasn't enough. They believed Boyd had played a much more direct role in the murders. In August 2009, Ludovic Cobbins faced a Knox County jury. After hearing the evidence, they sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 2 months later, Lamarcus Davidson, identified as the ringleader, was sentenced to death. George Thomas received life without parole. Vanessa Coleman, at just 18 years old, was sentenced to 53 years in prison. By 2010, it appeared that justice had been served. The families could finally begin to heal. Then, everything collapsed. Judge Richard Baumgartner had presided over all 4 high-profile trials, but court watchers had begun to notice concerning behavior. In March 2011, the shocking truth emerged. Baumgartner had been living a double life, marked by severe drug addiction and judicial misconduct. The Tennessee Supreme Court was forced to review the convictions after evidence emerged of the judge's impairment during the trials. Baumgartner was ultimately disbarred, and the state convictions were initially set aside because of his misconduct. For the Christian and Newsom families, this was a devastating blow. Years of painful testimony, of reliving their worst memories in pursuit of justice, had been invalidated by judicial corruption. The Tennessee Administrative Office of the Courts received more than 16,000 email petitions from citizens requesting that the retrials be stopped, but the legal system had to run its course. Retrials were originally scheduled for summer and fall of 2012. The families faced the prospect of enduring the entire legal process once again. However, the orders for retrials of Davidson and Cobbins were subsequently overturned by the Tennessee State Supreme Court, and their convictions and sentences stand. The state's highest court determined that despite Baumgartner's misconduct, the overwhelming evidence against these 2 defendants made their convictions sound. Coleman and Thomas did face retrials, resulting in new convictions, though Coleman received a reduced sentence. The final chapter came in 2019, when Eric Boyd finally faced state murder charges. After more than a decade of the family's persistent advocacy, Boyd was convicted and sentenced to life without parole plus 90 years. From this tragedy came meaningful legal reform that ensures future victims and their families will never face the same systemic failures. The Chris Newsom Act eliminated Tennessee's 13th juror rule, which had allowed a single judge to invalidate a jury's unanimous verdict. Under this law, once a jury delivers a unanimous verdict, it stands preventing the kind of judicial corruption that forced the Christian and Newsom families to endure multiple trials. The Channon Christian Act protects victims from character assassination in court, ensuring that defense attorneys cannot make irrelevant allegations against victims unless directly related to the case. These laws stand as lasting monuments to 2 young people whose deaths brought about changes that protect others. The house at 2316 Chipman Street was demolished in 2008. Today, a memorial stands in its place, ensuring that Channon and Chris are remembered with dignity rather than allowing their memory to be forever tied to the scene of their suffering. The Channon Gale Christian Foundation provides scholarships for University of Tennessee students, continuing her dream of helping others achieve their educational goals. The Chris Newsom Memorial Foundation holds annual baseball tournaments, celebrating his love of the sport while providing scholarships to local students. From the 6th of January, 2007, a date that will forever mark one of Tennessee's darkest days. But 18 years later, the names Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom represent something more than tragedy. They represent change, protection for other victims, and the enduring power of families who refuse to let their children be forgotten. 5 killers thought they could commit the perfect crime, thought they could erase 2 young lives without consequence. Instead, they created a legacy of justice that grows stronger every year. Laws now protect victims because of Channon and Chris. Students receive scholarships in their memory. Their killers will never walk free again. Evil tried to have the final word on the 6th of January 2007. Instead, love, justice, and memory won. Their names deserve to be remembered not as victims, but as forces for change whose impact continues to protect others. Channon Christian and Christopher Newsom. Say their names, remember their stories, honor their legacy. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light and honoring the memory of victims whose stories deserve to be told.